Welcome to the 409th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology. I'm coming to you live from Daejeon, South Korea. Today is February 7th, 2022. Today, I welcome Marxist feminist scholar Sue Ferguson, author of the essay Life Making or Death Making. Just a reminder, you can usually catch COVID Calls live on weekdays at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. That's a new time for COVID Calls, and we'll be using that time for now into the middle of March. You can hear COVID Calls anytime recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @USOfDisaster or @COVIDCalls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics. And as always, please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. I've been reading an obituary or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is A Dad, a Grandfather, a Farm Worker. A family remembers Tomas Reyes Soto. This appeared in Valley Public Radio, California by Maddie Bolanos, and the story appeared February 4th, 2022. My grandpa's name was Tomas Reyes Soto, writes Maddie Bolanos, but we all called him Papi Tomas. He died on December 13th, 2020, a week before his 69th birthday. In the year since his death, I've had a lot of time to think about his legacy and what his decisions meant for me and my future. I feel this extreme sense of gratitude for him. My Papi Tomas taught me the value of hard work, to have pride in my work, and that nothing was out of my reach. Papi Tomas was born in Pueblo Nuevo in the Mexican state of Durango in 1951. When he was 12 years old, he started making the trip to the neighboring state of Sinaloa to work picking tomatoes. On one of his trips at age 16, he met my grandma, Elisa Aguilar Zepeda, or Mami Licha. She says he was very direct. He went up to me and said, "You're going to be my wife, Chaparita." She says in Spanish. I told him, "You're crazy." That Saturday, he sent a mariachi that played music from northern Mexico. They married and had 5 kids together. Soon after, they moved to Mexicali on the border of California and Mexico. He made and sold tacos. My mom, Monica, says some of her favorite memories are helping him cut the cabbage and tomatoes. I just remember he used to make the best tacos, the best flour tortillas, tacos with the best salsas, she says. He made really good spicy salsa. That was his thing. But my grandma says Papi Tomas always had bigger dreams to move to the United States. He never attended school as a child. Mami Licha says he didn't want that for his kids. So in 1985, Tomas took his wife and kids through the desert to cross the border. He had the idea that his children had to grow up in the United States and that they were going to be the best there, she says. He was always proud of their accomplishments. When our 2 oldest children graduated from university, he cried so hard. He would tell all of us, "You'd better pay attention in school or this will be your future," my mom says. And I took it literally. I wanted to get straight A's because I did not like working in the fields. Papi Tomas's kids remember him as a tough love kind of dad, but that changed when he became a grandfather. I was born when my mom was 20 years old, the author writes. She was a single mother. Many people told her she was making the wrong decision by keeping me, including my grandpa. My mom says the relationship was contentious for the first year of my life, but she was determined to prove him wrong and everyone else who doubted her. She was going to be a successful single mom because her dad taught her to be hardworking and determined. She got a job as a teller at a bank. Now she works as a lending consultant, and she owns a new home in the same fields her dad took her to pick olives in as a teenager. During that time, he worked as a supervisor in the fields. After picking me up, he'd usually have to go back to work or run a few work-related errands. I remember on one of those days, we stopped at the gas station near his house, and from inside his truck, he called out to a woman on the street. He told her, "Be careful, immigration agents are driving around the neighborhood." He was always looking out for his undocumented community. At the start of the pandemic, Papi Tomas took COVID-19 very seriously. He only went to work in the fields and home. Then in late November 2020, Mami Licha contracted the virus while working as a housekeeper at the hospital. Papi Tomas took care of her. Then he contracted the virus, and so did my mom. My body was in a lot of pain, and all I can think of is that I hope my dad is not in the same pain that I'm going through, my mom says. And the next day, when we learned that he had passed away, it was painful. He had been sick for a few days. My grandma tried convincing him to go to the hospital, but he told her he didn't want to die alone. She tried to convince him that since she worked at the hospital, she would check in on him as often as she could. He still refused. My mommy Licha found him at home, lifeless, after a night shift at the hospital. That morning, I remember waking up to a scream from across the house. My cousins had gotten the news. My mom, who had been bedridden for days, suddenly had the energy to get dressed. We all raced to the car, tears streaming down our faces as we made the 25-minute drive to my grandparents' house. Tomas Reyes Soto passed away on December 13th, 2020. He died in his sleep, laying on his side with his hands clasped together in front of him. For me and for my mom, the grief is still very real. A year after my grandpa died, I graduated college and got an internship in Washington, D.C. The day before I left, I went to visit him. I told him how grateful I was for his sacrifices, the values he instilled in my mom that she passed on to me, values that allowed me to fly across the country to pursue my dream of becoming a reporter. We hugged and shared a few tears together. Later that day, my mom says he called her to tell her she did a good job raising me. I felt and still feel indebted to him and my mom for the sacrifices they made for me. I'm just happy I was able to tell him that before he passed away. The story was a dad, a grandfather, a farm worker. A family remembers Tomas Reyes Soto. This appeared in Valley Public Radio by Maddie Bolanos and appeared February 4th of this year, 2022. Okay, I'd like to turn to my conversation for today, and please let me introduce my guest to you, Susan Ferguson. Susan Ferguson is Associate Professor Emerita at Wilfrid Laurier in Canada. Prior to joining the Academy, she worked as a journalist for Maclean's, Canada's national news magazine. Ferguson is a Marxist, feminist scholar and activist who has been reading, writing, and thinking about social reproduction theory for many years. Her published work includes articles on feminist theory, childhood and capitalism, and Canadian political discourse. Her book, Women in Work, Social Reproduction, Feminism, and Labor, was published in 2020 by Pluto Press. Ferguson is also a member of Faculty for Palestine and on the editorial board of Midnight Sun. She's currently living in Houston, Texas. Sue Ferguson, welcome to COVID Calls.
Hi, thanks, Scott. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I'd like to start the way I generally do, just find out a little bit more about where you're calling in from and what the pandemic situation looks like there.
Sure, right. I'm living in Houston now. I've been here for, we moved down here a year before the pandemic began. So we got a little bit of a taste of Houston before everything shut down. But yeah, no, Houston is major city and more urban area than a lot of Texas. It's in terms of walking around, going into stores, etc. It's fairly decent. A lot people are generally masked, etc. Of course, like everywhere else, we have had the Omicron surge. It has peaked. It's now going down, but the ICUs are still very, very full. Infection rates or testing positivity rates are still pretty high. But hospitalizations are falling off a little bit now. So, it's a mixed bag right now.
It's quite a time to have moved from Canada to the United States. It puts you in a unique position, though, also to compare the two health systems. Have you kept up with friends back in Canada? What's their experience versus yours?
Well, in terms of our own personal health care. Because we moved down here because my husband has got a position at the University of Houston, and it's a well-paying position, and we have access to our Blue Cross Blue Shield healthcare. So in many ways, I'm not feeling more vulnerable or anything here. I do find that there is an awful lot of it's a kind of complicated system down here, as opposed to in Canada. If you need to go to the doctor, you go to there's one bureaucracy that you work with, whereas here you have to work with lots of different bureaucracies depending on which healthcare provider you're going to or whatever. But in terms of healthcare access, I mean, absolutely. I'm shocked down here to see people on the streets with signs saying that they need to pay their hospital bills, and could you please give them, $1 or whatever. I like that is heartbreaking to me, and you don't see that. For that, you see people on the streets in Canada for sure who need money, but not to pay their healthcare bills, etc. So,
do you have a personal memory of this pandemic time that really resonates for you?
well, I mean, you had warned me that you'd ask me that question. I was trying to think it through because, again, relatively privileged position. I don't have in many ways, I've been lucky, privileged throughout this period. And one of the things I keep saying to people is I don't even have young children at home anymore. And so that, to me, that would be quite a tax on my energies, I'm sure. But I did. So I was trying to think. I have certainly. Like everybody else, I've had interactions with relatives, senior people who have been ill and or died, not necessarily from COVID, but I had an aunt right at the very beginning of this has stuck with me quite a bit, actually. An aunt right at the very beginning of COVID in April of 2020, and she was 93. She's a single woman who never had any children, and myself and my two sisters had, in the last couple years, number of years, been kind of looking out for her and helping her. And she actually was getting quite ill, and in Ontario you can do a medical assisted death, and so she had actually opted for that at the beginning of COVID, which was hard to organize, but we helped her with that. And I mean, what was so hard in many ways, if it had not been for COVID, I would have been there with her while she died. And I couldn't be. I have one sister in Toronto, and so she was able to go, but the two other sisters, myself and my other sister, is in Chicago. And so, we couldn't cross the border at that point at all. Unvaccinated people were having to quarantine for 2 weeks. We couldn't get there in time. And so, something like that really does stick with you, because and I couldn't, I mean, we weren't going to zoom in on it because it felt very voyeuristic to do something like that. The point would be to be there for her so very, very sad. And I think that's one very small example of what so many people, have gone through. I think dealing with death during this pandemic, whether it's been from COVID or from other causes, has been really difficult for people, because you can't gather and grieve in the same ways. We've actually lost a couple other people too, and it's hurt so much not to be able to grieve properly.
Thanks for sharing that, and I'm sorry that your family went through that, and I'm glad you shared it too, because I think for many people hearing that also, it's helpful to hear, because I've talked to lots of people who have had that sense of distance. Either somebody was ill, maybe they didn't even die, but just the distance
Yes.
from people in need and family, but also, of course, with end of life issues. And even the obituary I just read of Tomas Reyes Soto, and the fact that he didn't want to go to the hospital because he was afraid of dying alone.
Yeah.
It's been a real theme throughout this entire pandemic. It's not something that most of us like to think much about.
No, I know. I think we sort of take for granted the ways in which we organize or process deaths in society or whatever. And then, the pandemic, like so much of life, it has jilted us out of the ordinary. And I think, yeah, and that's just a very poignant way in which people have had to really come to terms with and create new ways of doing things, I guess, too.
Just a quick reminder that I'm talking to Marxist feminist scholar Sue Ferguson today on COVID calls. And Sue, I discovered your work actually, in a sense, too late, I want to say, and I can't wait now to go back and read your articles and your book. But I discovered this tremendous essay that you published in Midnight Sun magazine in October, titled Life Making and Death Making. And I want to talk about that, but I'd like to talk about some of your earlier work first. And as a scholar of social reproduction theory, maybe we should start there for listeners who may not be as familiar with what that's about, and talk about that and how that's influenced the kind of topics that you've researched and written
Sure.
about in your career before COVID.
Sure. So social reproduction theory is really just a way of trying to understand the world, the social systems that we're all caught up in, and it comes out of the Marxist feminist tradition of understanding the world, and it's an attempt to build upon, a Marxist critique of capitalism. So the Marxist critique of capitalism, as people will know, is very much about how value is and profit is generated. And the argument is that it is generated through the exploitation of labor power, which is when you go to work at a factory or at Amazon or whatever, that the capitalist, the boss, is making money off of your labor power. And so social reproduction theory says, yes, that's true, but that's not the whole story of capitalism. The whole story of capitalism is that, in fact, capitalism, in organizing wage labor in particular ways, has also made it helped us to organize, or not helped us, I guess, organized our unpaid labor in other ways too, in ways that are not always, which are, in fact, in ways that are not about enhancing our lives, but are in ways about kind of controlling our lives in some ways too. And so social reproduction theory sort of looks at productive or value-making labor and life-making labor as two forms of labor that actually sustain capitalism. And so it's not, capitalism isn't just sustained by the extraction of value at work. It's sustained by the work that we do to create lives so that those lives can then go to work and produce value for capital. So
there's some critical insights here I want to draw you out on a little bit more. I mean, one seems to be around types of labor that have been historically feminized in the West. So therefore they haven't been counted, and maybe some of them are even wage labor work, like care work of nursing, for example, or teaching, which have been feminized and therefore counted differently. That's one type. But the other is actual reproductive labor itself, child rearing, child raising. Can you say a little bit more about how those factor into the development of theory over time?
Sure. Okay. So yes, absolutely, and that is the point. Social reproductive labor tends to be feminized. It also tends to be racialized, and the reason for that is because in creating human beings, it's not a very profitable thing to do. There is and people create themselves and their families, etc., largely through wages on the one hand, and tax, and a tax basis, right? The social services that we have, like education and healthcare. In Canada, it's healthcare. And there's some obviously socialized healthcare here too in the States. But but my point is that those capital, in order to sustain itself, needs to keep wages and taxes down. Those are the very things that people rely on to make their own lives. And so there needs to be a way of kind of degrading that labor that goes into making human life. And the historic oppression of women, the historic oppression of racialized people, the historic dispossession of Indigenous people, all of that can factor into helping to regulate and ensure that the costs of our social reproduction are kept low. And so that's, the argument is that that's a reason why why those efforts at life making are often done by racialized, feminized people. So I'm not sure I've answered your question directly there, but that sort of expands sort of the understanding of how social reproduction theory works. And yeah, I've been, working through those arguments and developing them out of they came out of kind of 1970s, late 60s, early 70s feminism. So that's where my efforts have been. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about that. So the interplay between activism and further development of the theorization along the lines that you're talking about. It seems, that the crucial insights, I mean, I guess they were there in Marx, but the crucial insights that you're talking about also, I think, seem to be connected with the rise of feminist activist politics. I shouldn't say rise, it's always been there, but more mainstream, let's say, in the United States, starting in the 60s.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. So that it definitely comes out of that period, and where there's a real attempt to try to understand how is it that you can understand capitalism as something that is part and parcel of or that uses, I guess, sexism and racism, and there are attempts to understand how they are the same system, how they work together, even if they might be, and they are also somewhat separate, right? Like, it's not that we're not, women are not oppressed simply because capital needs cheap labor, but women's oppression takes certain forms because capitalism needs cheap labor. And similarly for racial oppression, I'd say.
And you've written about capitalism and childhood, and I wonder if you could say a little bit about that work.
Yeah, I mean, I was sort of intrigued by thinking through the question of how childhoods are socially reproduced in capitalism. And one of the key things about children, I think children pose a kind of interesting problem for capital, because ultimately, capital bosses really only need your labor power. They don't need your whole humanity. But we're not born as people who will just naturally give up our labor power. Nobody is born into being what you'd call a capitalist subject. You become a capitalist subject, and you become a capitalist subject throughout your lifespan. You become it every day as well. So it's not even like adults are fully formed capitalist subjects, I think, but children in particular are are not shaped in order to be people who would necessarily be workers for capital, people who would be exploitable people. And so my work there is really around trying to understand what are the social forces and dynamics that work to shift children into being capitalist subjects. And one of the things that I think is really interesting to think about is how children are actually workers in some ways, in the sense that they are players. They are constantly interacting with the world around them in sensual, creative ways that we would associate with the best types of work, and so there's just this kind of ambivalence then that develops around childhood over, we want to, I think, connect with that playfulness, yet at the same time, as parents, we're worried about them being productive human beings, and we have to contain that playfulness. And capital, the state and school and education and everything is part of helps shape gives us a framework through which all that gets worked out, the negotiation between what's play and what's work, and when do you learn to stop playing and only become workers, and etc. So that's sort of where that whole project goes in my mind anyway.
I was talking with journalist Tara Haley the other day about something related. We were talking about the sort of rhetoric of getting back to normal in the United States. So much of that revolves around the schools, and it's a hard truth, but I think it's a real truth that so much of the emphasis of getting kids back in schools has to do with getting kids in school so parents can work.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it's not to say it's either or, and I'm not saying parents don't want their children to learn and thrive, but the larger structural issue really has to do with household economic pressure, which then forces children,
Yeah.
and often I would say, unfortunately, into spaces that are not as safe as they could be. In some cases,
Yeah.
quite dangerous spaces in states that have done away with vaccine mandates, things like that. So it's not about childhood per se, but I wonder how you see that problem looking back now, through the lens of COVID, how you see that earlier work about childhood.
Right. Well, I mean, I think it's sort of interesting because I think you know, there's a fascination with childhood in capitalist liberal democracies, cultural, for sure, and it tends to be seen as sort of almost a redeeming feature of society that we have these playful, wonderful, celebratory childhoods, and we educate our children well, and all this. But that's very much an ideal, and actual childhoods are very, very different. And I think with COVID, as I think I've said before in writing that COVID really shines a bright light on how society really works and on how our social reproduction really works. So the social reproduction of childhood gets clearer to people. They understand it better, I think, with something like COVID, because you've been stopped in your tracks from the normal everyday life, and you've had to kind of renegotiate things like what you do with your child when they're at home. And not just you, but everybody at work is doing the same thing. So yes, and what we're seeing now, absolutely, with the return, the kind of very callous return to school, and it's not that kids shouldn't, don't benefit from being at school too. Like I don't, I want to make that clear, but I do think that the lack of choice that people have about whether to keep their children safe or whether to send them to school where they may not be safe, or where they may be, a vector for transmitting COVID back to people in the household that may then get sick or whatever. So there's no. You can see how there's a kind of despite all the rhetoric around how precious our children are, we're not really keeping them safe. And we're not really even all that worried about educating them, because, of course, we're sending them to schools where there are no teachers often now, too, because so many teachers are sick and quitting. And so I think those are all, they shine a light on the hypocrisies, I guess, of that kind of ideal sense that the West is known for, having this wonderful celebration of childhood or whatever, and it's not true. It really isn't. And but anyway, so I think COVID shines a really bright light on that, which is nice, although sad. Nice that the reality is clearer, but it's also a very sad reality, of course.
I want to turn to this essay you wrote, Life Making and Death Making. And I'm going to read a sentence from it that it was one of these sentences. And I read a lot about COVID, but this one just really made me sit up straight. And you wrote, as the pandemic has made crystal clear in the trade-off between economic health and workers' health, capitalism sides with the former, which is another way of saying that capitalism sides with death over life. So lay out the landscape of this article for us a little bit. We understand the kind of theory and cases that you've been interested in your career, and so here comes this
COVID.
global pandemic.
Right. I mean, I think what I'm trying to get at there is, and especially how many months, 20 months now into the pandemic, we've seen capitalism is rebounding. Profits are up. Actually, I was reading even today something that said in the US profits are up by 70% from last year. That's amazing. And there's a total of $1.8 trillion of new wealth that's been created by who? By workers, right? But so capitalism is chugging along. It may not chug along beautifully forever. In fact, there are signs that it probably won't, and that it's also, as we know, quite a crisis-ridden system. But it's chugged along at a tremendous cost of people's lives. And that's what I mean by it being the rush to get back to normal, to get back to and economic health has been, at the cost of people's real health of life. And so, and we know that throughout the pandemic, there, a lot of low wage people who had no choice, who could not even necessarily low wage, but actually just people who were not able, they were called essential workers. They were not able to stay home, or or simply they wouldn't have had any paycheck if they didn't stay home. They, people who were without any of the subsidies that some governments gave out. Those people right away, their lives were being compromised. The people's lives who were really compromised at the very beginning of the pandemic, and this is entirely true in Canada as here too, but in Canada, I think it really stands out. I don't have the stats, but I'm pretty sure during the first wave of the pandemic, it was close to like 80% of the deaths were in senior living homes,
Right.
So, and so who are these, how come? How could we not put resources towards people whose lives were really on the line? And, then the point of that article too was to say it's a lot of the people who's as workers who were dying were the people or getting sick were people who were frontline healthcare workers and frontline, and now it's frontline teachers, and so it's often the social reproducers who have paid the price for capitalist accumulation. And you have to ask why, is it worth it? And I would say, no, it's not. It's to enrich the few at the expense of many lives.
So there was a moment, I wish it had been longer than a moment, but that's a
Mm,
few months at the beginning of the pandemic in the United States. I mean, looking back at that period with the lockdowns,
mm,
and the sort of government payments, it does really seem like a very, very different
yeah,
period in the pandemic. But there was something that never happens in the United States, mostly bipartisan, massive government spending under a Republican
yeah,
administration, paycheck protection, direct subsidies to businesses, but also to workers, small businesses, large businesses.
yeah,
I mean, it was something we hadn't really seen in the United States in so long that people didn't remember it. And the only vestiges of it left now are a couple months left in deferred student loan payments. But it
right,
was pretty dynamic, neo-Keynesian, as you write in your piece, sort of
yeah,
push.
yeah.
And I wonder how you interpret that.
So, I mean, it's so interesting because at prior to COVID, I would have said, when the expansion of support for life making from the state almost invariably happens because working class people fight for it. And that is true. That's how Canada got healthcare, public healthcare. That's how a lot of things have happened. But what you had at the beginning of the pandemic was capital saying, "Oh my God, we rely on people to get to work, and now with this pandemic, these people, if they come to work, they will die. So we need to do something." So it was capital that pushed for those expansions. I mean, so did working class people, but it was definitely supported by, as I think I make the point in the article, the IMF, for instance, the International Monetary Fund, which is a neoliberal, austerity imposing global finance institution. So you have a recognition there of just how much capitalism depends on life making. And so that's all good and well. And so, yes, it was amazing to see these things. The other thing that was, that proved to us was that where there's a will, there's a way. The political will was there.
Right.
You could spend that money. There was no the floodgates were open. Trillions of dollars went out into the economies, and so it's not a fact. It's not the case that there's no resources so much as it is a case that eventually the political will shuts down. And that's because there's a way in which capitalism can continue to churn, and always has and always will, by having enough people but not supporting life, by having uh, forcing some people to work in very risky situations, and forcing a lot of people to work in very risky situations, but also
Mm.
be in creating just barely enough sustenance for people to go on selling their labor. And so it's not, these, however much people like to think of capitalism as a society about of freedom, and that it's not really about our freedom. It's about how do we contain ourselves so that we are free enough to work for capital.
So
And
this
I find
this
that awful.
yeah, and I think, and there's some important kind of caveats there you point out. I mean, this process, I think you term it life making from above. This
Mhm.
process of government expenditure to basically to sustain life in a period of time which people seemingly can't work,
Yeah,
or they can't work safely, except um, essential workers, as you point
right.
out. Many, and the essential worker category in the United States kept expanding and shifting.
Yes,
So when it became a political, it seemed there were some problems with the supply chain with the meat supply. So now all of a sudden there's an executive order telling meat producers they have to be at work. Same true
that's
for
right.
other agricultural settings. And then, as you earlier pointed out, I think this is really good insight that for those who were not in the economy, in the mainstream economy as laborers, so either
Mhm.
children or those who are in nursing facilities or long-term care facilities, they're left out of that equation, and by extension, the direct subsidies that could have gone to help them
Yeah.
were not there, at least not at the beginning. So there's all of these sort of, they may seem like kind of carve outs to the overall, what seems like government responds forcefully, but in reality, I think there's many, many caveats there that are very distressing to me.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we see that there's actually another very good article on in Midnight Sun by Daniel Sarah Karasik, which is called Pandemic Realism, I think, or something. And but I might have that title wrong, but where they argue that there are places where there have been COVID zero or near COVID zero policies. China is one, very authoritarian. They're not holding that up as a beacon of the way forward, but they're basically saying it's been possible. The east coast of Canada, the provinces, were very, very careful to limit and trace and track and test. So the New Zealand is another good example. So like these places, where they've actually shown that it's been possible to really contain and possibly get to a zero COVID situation, but that's not the majority of, that's not where the majority of the capitalist countries have gone. And, that's all a matter of a calculation. And that these other countries, you can talk about China separately, but although I think it operates on a capitalist kind of system as well, is just as organized by the state differently. But these other, it's not that these other countries aren't capitalist or these other spaces aren't capitalist, but they have been pushed more for in different ways to respond, to have the state respond in particular ways that have maybe been, well, have definitely been smarter in terms of containing the virus.
How much do you think that the pandemic has been a referendum on the sort of larger social commitments of countries to increase the social safety net? And and I ask that because countries, many European countries have had high COVID rates,
Yeah.
um, and they do have a large, like take Germany for example, or various Scandinavian countries that have large social safety net and services,
Yeah.
and they still suffered disease as well. So how do you parse that in comparison to countries like the United States or Brazil, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really hard. I think I I think that there's so much within a particular country's political, um, economic makeup. So the relationship of the, depending what, a little bit on what party's in power, depending on the nature of the relationship between the political decision makers and the economic decision makers, that will vary. So I think you will get different outcomes. You do get different outcomes in different places. Um, that and Yeah, it's been interesting. There's been no, I think, easy to find pattern about types of regimes and their success in battling COVID or whatever. And I think that just speaks a lot to, I guess, um, the fact that there's going to be a certain give in the amount that the state can manage and kind of give into the and the amount that the state can and the extent that the state is willing to give into forces that push back against capital. But and so yeah, I mean, and that will depend so much on sort of the balance of whatever the political pulls and struggles are in those particular places. So I don't know if that.
Yeah, no, I think it's too early to say, but I think a lot of that has been a discussion about the death rate, and
Yeah,
and I think of course, that's a factor. Of course, our numbers on deaths
terrible here.
are too low.
Yeah.
They're terrible and even
Oh,
too
yes,
low.
yes, yeah,
Um,
yes, you're right. Yeah.
but it will be other things, I think. Personal bankruptcies,
Mm,
medical bankruptcies,
mhm.
things that we don't count very well. I mean, I've been working with um, Jacqueline Burnamont and Robert Soden
Okay.
on trying to write about what we call accounting for care. And there's
Yeah,
so many things, and I think this fits in very well with the work you do in social reproduction. Just so much of what matters in an overall society are things that economists don't count, or they don't count
right.
well.
Yep,
And so those will be the measures ultimately. I mean, I'm
right.
trying to answer this very hard question that I
Yeah,
asked you. And I think I guess my point is, I think the pandemic is correct, but there are all these other epiphenomena that will all tell maybe a clearer story in the longer period of
mhm.
time.
So I hope you can. I'll look forward to reading that.
So I want to be mindful of time in my discussion with Sue Ferguson today, but I did want to ask you. You also use this wonderful phrase in the piece, "life making from below."
Mhm.
So that's different from paycheck protection. What does that mean?
Well, I mean, we all do our life making from below. We all organize the way in which we work to produce our and reproduce our lives. But I think what you get with the pandemic happening is that there's an because there were gaps in care that from the institutional level, because we had this, rapid shutdown of the economy. We people scrambled and coordinated and developed ways of provisioning for themselves and each other collectively often. And you see that happen whenever there you would know that studying disasters. You see that happening wherever there are disasters that happen. And actually there's a really nice book too called Disasters in Social Reproduction by Pierre Illner. I can write that in your chat. But that talks exactly about this. Make sure I've got the there we are. Um, whoops, sorry. So, but and that's also by Pluto in the same series that my book's published in. But the I think the rise of mutual aid societies, the development of people neighborhood committees that helped feed and bring groceries to other people, those sorts of things. That was a real reorganization of our social reproduction. And what is interesting about that is it shows that there are other ways of organizing, and there are collective ways of organizing. What I would argue in a lot of the case, they tend to wax and wane a little bit with need, obviously. But I think if we were to expand our ideas around what social reproduction from below and politicize our ideas around that, it would be really, really helpful. So you get something like the Black Lives Matter protests that argue for defunding the police and putting resources into communities instead. Take the money from reproducing ourselves from above, because the police are a form of social reproduction from above too. They're a coercive form that regulates our people so that we have particular populations in the US, very much Black and Indigenous populations are more heavily policed in public spaces, so their lives are more constrained in certain ways. And But if you removed the funding from the police and actually fed that into the communities, then you would actually have the resources there for people to actually organize, continue to organize, and develop ways of producing their lives collectively, and not even just producing their lives, but maybe even enhancing their lives, which is something we rarely talk about. Like, where is a social commitment to actually making people's lives better and richer and funner, those sorts of things. So,
We've been just talking for 2 years now. We've been just talking about survival.
yes, yeah, it's very sad. And yet, human beings are creative, wonderful people. And, I know there are some nasty human beings out there, but what I mean is, we've seen that. I think that COVID has taught us that people were and will come together and help each other. They always do in a disaster.
I think that's, again, going back to that earlier period of the pandemic, I've been struck, and I've talked about this on COVID calls before, but that lockdown period, in which people around the world basically participated in a collective action, the like of which we have not seen
Yes.
in a long, long time. And they did it partially because they were afraid to protect themselves, but in the main, they did it to protect people they'll never meet.
Yes.
And so when I get really down, I do think about that moment of solidarity as a building block. I just don't want to lose it.
Yeah, and it's hard. It's hard because we all get very busy with our own little lives when things go back to normal, right? And so it's very, very tricky. And that's why I also tried to make, although I didn't say it very well, the point about it. It's so important to politicize this stuff. To think through, what do we need to do? How can we make these demands more public? And how can we get the resources that we really, really need from the state? And how can we connect that with the demands of, everyday workers at work to actually have more control over their lives at workplaces too? So I think that's very much part, the article that I wrote was very much about saying capitalism systemically undermines us and our life making, and that we have to start, of course, by making these demands to enhance our life making, but we can't do, there'll be a limit to how much we'll be able to achieve if we are still in a capitalist society, whatever, throughout this, because the capital, because it has to keep taxes and wages low, because it needs people to do jobs at low wages, will continue to support racism, sexism, and exploitation, and colonialism. I mean, so it's sort of all built into a system that we need to start thinking about. How do we reorganize not just work at workplaces, but work of life making too? And how can we bring those things together? And that's sort of what I mean by politicizing it too.
I want to remind everyone that you've been listening to COVID Calls, and I've been talking today with Sue Ferguson, and she's the author of Women in Work, Social Reproduction, Feminism, and Labor, which came out with Pluto Press in 2020. And then please do check out her wonderful article in Midnight Sun magazine, Life Making or Death Making, and I put the link up here, or you can just go to midnightsunmag.ca and you can read that there, and the other articles that are there. And Sue Ferguson, I learned a lot in this discussion with you and from your writing, and can't wait to read more. Thanks for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a great to meet you and to be able to participate in this. Thanks so much.
Stay healthy, everyone. We'll see you next time on COVID Calls.